Bentley here. Good evening to you. On behalf of the Calgary Climate Hub, I welcome you to A Climate of Change, our weekly live cast exploring with thought leaders from across Canada what this wildly unprecedented moment in history means for our province, this country, the economic system, and specifically the climate crisis. In the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge that we live, work, and play on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, the Tsuut'ina, the Yaaksi Nakota Nations, the Métis Nation of Region 3, and all people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region of southern Alberta. I'd also like to make a second land acknowledgement on behalf of another group of folks that have a stake in this land that we stand on today, and that is our children, our nieces and nephews and grandchildren, and all future generations. I urge you to keep them in mind during this time as we face unprecedented change and start making decisions about what comes next. For those of you watching tonight via Facebook Live, welcome, and please feel free to post some questions for our guest. As well as the folks participating in the Zoomcast, please post your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. Should you wish for me not to say your name, please type the word anonymous before your question, as this show will be shared to our social networks. Otherwise, we'll assume your consent in the use of your name in the broadcast. Tonight's guest has had his finger on the pulse of the Alberta energy scene for a long time. He's a creator of Energi Media and author of the new Alberta Advantage, Markham Hislop. On a personal note, I've been reading Markham for years, and as a climate advocate, I can't say I agree with all of his conclusions every time, but I can say he's a journalist of immense integrity, and that every conclusion he raises is based on his very best understanding of all the available data and facts on the subject, and after consulting a very deep pool of expert knowledge. Markham Hislop, welcome to A Climate of Change.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Steve. I'm really excited about this.
Excellent. Having read New Alberta Advantage, and I recommend it to our viewers or to anybody who'd like a deep understanding of Alberta's oil and gas scene, a relatively easy read and all that. That book closes off right after Rachel Notley's right after our last right before our last provincial election, actually. So a lot of things have changed in the realm of oil and gas since then, and so I feel like we'll just let you take the ball here and tell us about what you're seeing.
Well, thanks, Steve. And I think the best way to approach this is basically for me to start at the beginning, as it were. And we've created Energi Media in 2015. And everyone will know that on November 22nd, Rachel Notley's government announced, November 22nd of 2015, announced the Climate Leadership Plan. And my take on that at that time was that, look, it may not be enough from a climate change point of view or climate policy point of view, energy policy point of view, but it was way better than what Alberta has ever had. It was a great leap forward. It was probably about as much as could be implemented, and got enough pushback, as everyone knows, as it was. And so my take on this was that the oil sands had essentially achieved social license, or it had the policy and the policy framework that we could justify supporting the continued existence of the oil sands. Now, that's not a popular point of view in a lot of climate circles and environmental circles, and I frankly took some heat over the years. And I guess if I had to go back, I would probably moderate my views a little bit. I think I was maybe a little too pro oil sands over the years, but nevertheless, that was the rationale for my support of the oil sands, was the fact that there was this new policy framework in place that over time I assumed would get tougher and tougher. The carbon price would go up. There would be more policies and regulations to eliminate methane emissions, those sorts of things. But it was a good beginning. Now, it's really interesting what happened after the Climate Leadership Plan was announced. And to understand what happened after, you need to understand what happened before. And I didn't understand this at the time. In fact, it wasn't until 2018 that I actually did the reporting on it. And excuse me just a moment. I'm going to start I promised Steve that I'd start a stopwatch so that I keep this to 20 minutes. So in September of 2014, in a restaurant in Calgary, 5 oil sands CEOs, and included Steve Williams from Suncor, and Brian Ferguson from Cenovus, and Murray Edwards from CNRL, Lorraine Mitchell-Moore from Shell, one or two others. And they met with 5 executive directors of environmental groups. Ed Whittingham was there on behalf of Pembina Institute, for instance. And they were there at the behest, or not the behest, but the CEOs had initiated it. They were tired of being beaten up all the time, and they wanted peace in the valley. And so they went to Dave Collier, the former, actually was the CEO of CAP at that time. And they said, look, can you arrange this thing? And he went to Zipporah Berman and said, Zipporah, can you get, some environmental groups together, and we'll be co-chairs of these meetings. And so they began talking about, was there common ground between the oil sands companies and the environmental groups? And I've interviewed now probably a dozen people who were involved in that process. And I've interviewed, Shannon Phillips, the environment minister in Notley's government, Notley herself, all of that. So I've got a pretty good understanding of what went on during those meetings. And eventually, after some very, very difficult conversations, as you can imagine, the CEOs and the executive directors agreed on a suite of policy ideas. And this would be in the spring of 2015. And just as they were kind of wrapping up the meetings, or coming to a conclusion, that was when the election took place in May, and all of a sudden they thought they would have a Prentice PC government, and now they had the Notley NDP government. So what it basically looked like was the 100 megaton oil sands emissions cap that came out of those meetings, the 40 to 45% reduction in methane emissions that came out of there. There was an agreement to support a province-wide carbon levy, and there were another couple of other policy initiatives. But the basic handshake deal is this. The CEOs were most worried that the Prentice government was going to limit production of the oil sands in order to get a handle on the emissions. And so the CEOs wanted to avoid that at all costs. So they cut this deal with the environmental groups. They then took it to Shannon Phillips in September of 2015, and so she took that to Notley, and there were discussions, and eventually some of it wound up in the climate leadership plan. But the quid pro quo here is no production cap in return for climate policies, and a promise for the reduction of absolute emissions from the oil sands within a reasonable time. Now that is not in the climate leadership, wasn't in the climate leadership plan. It was part of the handshake deal between the CEOs and the Angos. And of course, those who follow the energy politics in Alberta will know where I'm going with this a little further into the conversation. So what happened then, and this is not well understood, is that agreement and the participation of the CEOs basically kicked off a civil war within the oil patch. So there were the progressive camp, if you will, and this is what Collier calls them, the progressive camp of CEOs. And arrayed against them were the CAP and the small producers and some of the intermediate producers, the service sector, the finance sector, people like Brett Wilson, for instance, would be part of that group. And they were the really hardcore, all the Albertan oil patch folks who really wish they were born in Texas, those kind of folks, the hardcore conservatives, and used to getting their way under PC government. They rebelled against what the CEOs had done, because they were really angry about not being at the table, and they saw the CEOs selling them out. And remembering, of course, that many of these, small and the junior producers, production under 10,000 barrels, intermediate producers, 10,000 to 100,000 barrels a day, they are climate deniers, friends of science, funders. I mean, that's the kind of folks that I'm talking about. So they went at it hammers and tongs from the end of 2015 through 2016, through 2017. Of course, there was a huge downturn, recession in Alberta. the oil prices fell. It was a very tumultuous time within the industry, and essentially the oil sands CEOs lost. They gave up. They didn't have the stomach for the fight. And you saw Brian Ferguson retire, Lorraine Mitchellmore retire, Murray Edwards kind of backed away from CNRL a bit, and a new generation of CEOs come in to run the oil sands companies who weren't part of those discussions, weren't part of the deal, and didn't feel committed to the handshake agreement. So meanwhile, I'm reporting on all of this, and then we see the rise of Jason Kenney and all of his rhetoric, and starting in like 2017 and especially ramping up in 2018 about criticism of the NDP energy climate policies and anti-carbon tax, and all of those things, and that was a real problem. And so the consensus around that handshake deal and the climate leadership plan was almost unraveled at that point. And at Energi Media, we essentially shifted our focus, because if that consensus was no longer valid, then our support for the oil sands was in question. And so I had to wrestle with the idea of what am I going to say in my columns? How are we going to approach this? And basically what I did is I was a fierce critic of Jason Kenney, even long before before the election of 2019. And that would really start in the fall of 2018, I think, when he became more critical of Notley's performance, and then there was the whole Trudeau-Notley alliance that was imposing itself on Alberta, all of that kind of heated rhetoric around that time. So when we came to the early 2019, I wanted to write a book, and I basically wanted to defend the climate leadership plan and get back to that consensus that I thought was really critical to the climate leadership plan, all of that climate framework, the energy policy framework that we needed in Alberta. And so I wrote this thing, and I said, look, at least the oil sands companies get it. They understand. And the first couple of chapters are all about the energy transition and climate change, and how the world is changing. Alberta has to change with it. It has to adapt. The sooner you start, the better. I interviewed Harbir China, who is the VP of Technology at Cenovus, and he told me, he said, look, we really like a carbon price because it makes us more efficient. We're going to have to reduce our costs. We're going to have to reduce our carbon footprint, the carbon intensity of our crude oil, of the bitumen. And so he said, we really like that, but we want the longest runway possible. And I thought that was a really good metaphor, because if you shorten the runway, then when disruption happens, then the company, the industry, government, everybody can't react as effectively and efficiently as if they had the longer runway. And so I thought that was a good metaphor. And so I argued in the book, The New Alberta Advantage, Technology Policy, and the Future of the Oil Sands, that policy suite should be defended, and it either had to find its way into the next NDP government, or if the UCP won and Jason Kenney became premier, it should be retained. Well, of course, and then we came to the election campaign. It was a little fractious, as you recall. And I was a critic of Kenney, and unfortunately, he had a very effective energy narrative. Most of his facts were wrong. His policy framework was wrong. It was terrible policy initiatives. Nevertheless, he was able to weave it into a narrative that was attractive to voters. And of course, we know what happened. So now here we have the UCP government heading into mid 2019, and ever since then, Energi Media has been a very consistent critic of the Kenney energy and climate policies, getting rid of the province-wide carbon levy, changing the large emitter carbon pricing from CCIR to tier. Kenny has done the absolute least that he could do and still not have the federal government come in and impose something worse. And so anyway, where we find ourselves then is as 2019 wears on and we're getting into 2020, it's pretty clear at this point, and the Kenny government's only been around for 8 or 9 months, that it's a disaster. I mean, it literally, I think I wrote a column about a month and a half ago, in which I said that this was the worst energy government in the history of Alberta. They couldn't get anything right on climate. They couldn't get anything right on energy. None of the things that Kenny had promised during the campaign had come true. And in fact, his failures were a good indicator that, in fact, the climate leadership plan approach, the climate policy approach, was actually better for the industry than the Kenny's unbridled boosterism. So you remember 2 or 3 months ago that a bunch of, and Brett Wilson I think was part of this, Brad Wall, former Saskatchewan premier, certainly was, the Buffalo Declaration, which was really an awful, awful document. I mean, historically inaccurate, and it really was arguing mostly for secession of Alberta, and railed against climate policy and the Trudeau government incessantly. And I started out writing a piece in response to that. But at the same time, I was just finishing up a consulting contract. I helped Energi Futures Lab launch its My Energy Future campaign. And I asked myself, well, what's my energy future look like? How do I envision the Canadian energy future? And so I wrote the Energy Declaration, and it's 12 principles that I'd encourage you to go to our website. And I don't have time to go through all of them, trust me. But go to our website, energi.media, and you'll see it up in the nav bar, and you can have a look at it. It's 12 principles and then 20 pages of narrative, expert interviews, and so on that back up the 12 principles. And so I wrote that, and it's been getting a fair amount of support. People, it's where we need to go, and so if you would sign it and share it with your networks, I would very much appreciate it. We did a soft launch, and we want to build momentum as opposed to come out hard on this sort of thing. So you could help me out if you would do that, please. But part of it is, in addition to the Energy Declaration, I'm going to be doing vision chapters, because eventually I want this to be the next book, probably next year. And I'll do them for different sectors of the economy or different issues. So the first one out of the gate was the hydrocarbon vision. So this is my take on where Alberta needs to go. And every chapter, every vision will have at least one big idea. And the big idea for Alberta for hydrocarbons is that the oil sands needs to begin now to shift from producing bitumen for fuel and produce it for materials, and in particular, carbon fiber. So most everybody is familiar with Alberta Innovates, which is the public agency in Alberta that looks after innovation on the energy side. And it's been working on carbon fiber for a number of years now. I interviewed one of their executives, and he said, look, we're probably 5 to 7 years away from full-scale commercial production. The very thing that makes bitumen awful for fuel makes it exceptional for carbon fiber, a high carbon content. And so the challenge is not even so much technical. They'll figure out how to turn this into carbon fiber. The question is to do it at what price and what the commercial scale is. So they're working through all of that. And the big market here, at least in the short term or in the immediate future, let's put it that way, is the automotive industry. So as the companies, the automakers are shifting to electric vehicles, they want their vehicles to be lighter. They would love to begin building more carbon fiber into the chassis and into the body of the EVs, but they can't because carbon fiber is about twice as expensive as it needs to be. Well, Alberta Innovates thinks that this process they're coming out will cut the cost in half, and it'll be where where the automotive industry needs, and that opens up the floodgates, a tremendous market. And here's the kicker. If a barrel of bitumen is used to make carbon fiber, the value that's derived from that is 4 times higher than if you ship it off to a refinery in Texas. 4 times higher. So you can imagine what that would do for government revenues, for employment, for all sorts of, it would be an amazing thing for Alberta if we can make this happen. And so I published the hydrocarbon vision about a month ago, and lo and behold, Monday, everything changed, because on this Monday, Mark Little, the CEO of Suncor, that's Canada's largest integrated oil and gas company, and Laura Kilcrease, who's the CEO of Alberta Innovates, published an op-ed in the Corporate Knights magazine that I called extraordinary, and it really is. And you can go and see my column that I wrote on Tuesday on our website, and you can go on our YouTube channel, and you can see the interview I did with Laura yesterday. And what they argued in there, a couple of things that are really eye-grabbing. And that is, they agree that the industry needs to begin to pivot to materials. And the reason for that is the pandemic has shown them that it's like a preview of the potential demand disruption. That means that the 100 million barrels a day of demand for oil, consumption of oil, the 10.5 million barrels a day of heavy crude, which is the market that these guys play in, that could be disrupted very easily. And demand could peak much quicker than we had thought, and could begin to decline much quicker than we thought. And that would be an existential threat to these companies. And so they said, well, look, we need another market. We can't, there's no more market to be had in fuels. The only thing we can do is move into materials, and Alberta Innovates is well down the road on this, you know, making carbon fiber and then secondarily polymers and a bunch of other materials. That's where we need to go. Now that's the one extraordinary thing, because now you can foresee the hydrocarbon vision that I wrote, where they're decarbonizing, they're lowering their emissions, they need to do it faster. And as the fuels market shrinks, now they're pivoting over into materials production, and there could come a time in 2040 or 2050 where they don't produce for fuels at all. And all they do is produce for carbon fiber and other materials. That would be a tremendous structural change in the way, not only in the oil and gas industry in Alberta, but the entire economy, because you'd have a lot more manufacturing tied to it and a higher value, as I mentioned before. So that's one thing. But then they said something else. And if it had just been Alberta Innovates, that would be significant. But what made it extraordinary is the authors called for federal government leadership. Now think about that. When was the last time that anyone in Alberta in a leadership position, let alone the position that Mark Little is in with Suncor, asked the federal government to take the lead on funding and creating a public agency to shepherd the development and the commercialization of these new technologies? And especially when that federal government is headed up by a prime minister with the surname Trudeau. That is entirely unique, I think. So, and as you can imagine, this is, I haven't got a sense yet of what kind of a quake this set off in the Alberta oil patch, but I did get some hints from the interviews I did. And while the Kenney government is talking about diversification and the oil industry wants to move into materials, this is pretty radical. And so we'll see, and Energi Media, for its part, we will be supporting that new move. We think it's exactly the way it has, what the industry has to do. It's good for the climate, it's good for the environment, it's good for the economy, it's good for jobs, it's good for government revenue. I mean, it's all around, this is the right move. And the other I'll just quickly wrap up by saying the next vision that's coming is going to be electrification of transportation. And the emphasis so far has been on electrifying light duty trucks and cars, primarily cars, to reduce GHG emissions. I'm going to argue that the focus of public support should actually be on the commercial side. And that's for two reasons. One is you can reduce the emissions as fast as you would by focusing on passenger cars. But at the same time, you can do what China is doing, which is support the growth of strategically support the growth of a domestic industry. So we already have some electric bus manufacturers. We already have some electric coach manufacturers. We already have electric forklift and other kinds of work vehicle manufacturers. And that's the small core of a sector where there is room for us to grow our market niches and play a significant role there. So we've missed the boat. The automakers in US, Europe, and Japan and China are off. They're going to dominate the automotive, the light duty market. But the commercial market is still very much in play. And that is where Canada should be putting its resources. And we should have like a moonshot strategy where we say, look, we're going to own some of these market niches, maybe, work vehicles related to resource extraction for northern climates, whatever it might be. That's where we should go. So we reduce emissions and create jobs and get a lot of investment into the Canadian economy. So that's kind of where we're at. And I know I covered a lot of ground in a short period of time. So happy to take some questions. And Steve, fire away.
So, yeah, great. And that's a great update. I guess, when you think about Alberta, how many global structural forces have hit our prime industry from 2014, 2015, America becomes our greatest competitor instead of our greatest customer. You're now seeing that the big money people on the world stage are starting to back away from oil and gas. Tech decided not to build here, and then the coronavirus hits. There's just all these enormous global things that have nothing to do with Canada or with Alberta or any of it. It's just that's. I mean, tech made its decisions that based on some of these things, but how much jeopardy is oil and gas in right now, and are they aware of it?
This is the energy transition and the global efforts to fight climate change are an existential threat to the oil sands. And remember that 80% of the oil that gets produced in Alberta comes from the oil sands. Actually, 80% of Canadian oil is from the oil sands, and a higher percentage in Alberta is from the oil sands. So this is an existential threat. And this is one of the things that I've been trying to get across to the Kenney government and to the leadership in Alberta. Now, this sounds really silly. Here's Markham, and an independent online website, he's doing a good energy journalism, but he's trying to, tell these CEOs of $20 billion a year companies that they're wrong. Here's the problem. Here's the problem. I interview people all over the world. I interview people, experts in Europe, and lots of them in California and the United States. And one of the things I can tell you is that even within the industry of these huge companies, they are so insular and inward looking. Dave Collier calls it the Alberta lens. Mm-hmm. Everything that happens in the planet has to be viewed through the Alberta lens. Well, if it doesn't affect Alberta, then it doesn't exist, or it's irrelevant, or, so who cares what's happening about, that climate hoax or the energy transition, we don't see it in Alberta, therefore it doesn't exist. And my argument, has been for the last 3 or 4 years, change is coming. You can see we're about 20 years into an energy transition. The roots of that lie in the 20th century, with the work that went into solar panels in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and wind turbines, the electric vehicle, the EV1 that got, started in the 1990s. All of that laid the foundation for what is now energy technology that has no longer needs to be subsidized. It is the best economic choice. And the change, I'll tell you a little story. So in 2017, I was interviewing American battery scientists like YQ from Stanford and Alita Harbadelli from the University of Houston. And they were saying, look, we're going to see $100 a kilowatt battery prices, kilowatt hour for battery prices, but it'll be like 2030 maybe, right? So in 2017, my sources that I was interviewing were buying batteries at $195 a kilowatt hour. The next year, they were buying them for $135 a kilowatt hour. Now, GM and VW are right around $100 a kilowatt hour. So we've achieved what we should have achieved in 13 years, we've achieved in 3 years. And look at how the prices have fallen for wind and solar. According to Lazard, the bottom end of wind is now like 2.8 cents a kilowatt hour. And solar is 3.2 cents a kilowatt hour. Nobody expected this to happen this quickly. And it's only going to continue to accelerate. And we are now, for most of these technologies, including electric vehicles, if you think of the S-curve, the adoption S-curve as a hockey stick, they spent the last 20 years going from the toe of the hockey stick to the heel of the hockey stick, and now they're ready to get on the shaft. Right. And once they get on the shaft, disruptive change happens in a hurry. And I think finally, the CEOs at least in the oil sands companies, it's got into their heads that disruptive change is here, and it could happen a lot more profoundly and quickly than they had anticipated, and they need to act. So hope that answered your question, Steve.
Yeah, no, that's great. So the next question I have for you is, it's just a gut question. There's no right or wrong answer here. There's just your impression, but you know the subject as well as anybody on the planet. Do you think Teck would have withdrawn its effort on the tar sands if the climate leadership plan was in place and Rachel Notley was the premier?
Here's the problem. If you take a look at what is it, Don Lindsay, I think was the CEO's name. If you look at the letter that he sent withdrawing that project, it was 10 paragraphs long, and 7 of those 10 paragraphs dealt with climate policy. And the point that he made is that if you don't have a proper climate policy in the jurisdiction in which you're investing, investors think it's too risky. The perception of climate risk has gone way up in just the last 6 to 12 months. Everybody who's here tonight will know about BlackRock. Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock Inc., is now famous letter from mid-January, where he said climate risk is now affecting the reallocation of capital. And my guess, Steve, because they're not going to say this, but my guess is that Teck was shopping this around Wall Street and London, and they looked at that and they said, look at what Kenny did to climate policy. We like the climate leadership plan. We do not like the Kenny climate policy. Look at the problems with the oil sands. We will not put money into this project. And Teck took the opportunity to just kind of gently, back out of it before they were in too deep, take their $1 billion hit and walk away because they couldn't get it financed. Remember what Kenny said about the Keystone XL? There was not one single financier stepping up to put money into that project. Why would the Teck project be any different?
Right.
And I'm convinced that in fact is the reason, Steve, is that the money people told Teck, we're not supporting it. And so
yeah, it wasn't. They were pretty open about it. It wasn't economically feasible, I think was the phrase that you were hearing months in advance anyways. Okay, there's something I want to push back on you on. I hope that's okay.
Fire away.
Fair enough. So in the New Alberta Advantage, you mentioned a phrase that that I see other people in the oil and gas world use. Maybe it's not a phrase, but basically that the last barrel of oil that the world uses ideally comes from Alberta, something along those lines. And from my perspective, I feel like, as a climate guy, I feel like that's sort of like saying, the last bars to stop smoking from happening on the premises should be in Alberta, or the last schools that should stop using asbestos should be in Alberta. And part of me wants to look at it as, isn't that a race to last place?
You know what? I understand your argument, and I appreciate that point of view. The comment, and it's actually the last sentence in the book, only makes sense if you look at it within the context of climate policy, a strict climate policy in Canada and Alberta. And the fact that, and this is something I didn't mention, the 5 CEOs who sat across from Zipporah Berman and the executive directors, what they said was, we think that Asia, which is the market we want to get into, is over the next 5 to 10 years is going to be bringing in ever stricter climate policy, and they're going to be putting in carbon pricing schemes, and it'll be, the carbon price will be quite significant. If we lower our emissions, if we lower the carbon intensity of our heavy crude oil, we will have a competitive advantage in those markets over Venezuela or Saudi Arabia or Iran or Iraq, those competitors in the heavy crude market. So the context is not just the last drop of oil from anybody, but heavy crude oil. And that's a big distinction, because the heavy does not compete with the light. It's a separate market altogether, and they don't compete in the market, in the refinery market. So my idea behind that is, if the oil sands companies continue, basically get to a point where their production is carbon neutral, then they should be allowed to compete as long as there is a market for heavy crude, because Alberta is the only jurisdiction in the world that is actively trying to decarbonize its heavy. And so within that context, I think my argument makes a little bit more sense, as opposed to just, the race to be the last bar that has smoking.
Right, fair enough. Okay, so switching tacks a little bit, coronavirus went from something we were all dimly aware of to all of a sudden we're in lockdown. The whole world, every country, unprecedented. What do you think was the big prime teachable moment for you on that? For me, the teachable moment that I talk about all the time is that, as a climate advocate, I'm always told that, there's just not enough money for that. We could never afford this or that. And then it turns out, if the crisis is big enough and people are concerned enough about it, then we find the money right quick. So to me, that's my teachable moment on that. What sticks out to you as far as a teachable moment on the coronavirus?
I actually do have one. That's a really good question.
I ask good questions here, buddy.
I'm looking forward to more of them.
Yeah.
Mine was that many countries, including Canada, are looking at this and saying, you know what? We don't want to go back to the status quo. This is the lockdown, and the way we've changed our approach to energy and work and so on has given us the opportunity to look at the future and say, you know what? We could do this differently. We could do this better. We could get to a climate-friendly future, a low-carbon future, much quicker by taking a different approach. Mm-hmm. And I think, from my point of view, that was the thing. And you see particularly the Europeans, who are kind of leading the charge on climate policy. They're getting all ramped up and talking about taking combustion engine cars off the road and sooner than they had expected, and getting to carbon neutral sooner than they had originally forecast. So I think the way the lockdown, the pandemic, changed the way we think about the economy. And for a lot of folks, because the climate crisis is still as much of a crisis as it was before the pandemic, now they're thinking that, hey, we can do things differently, and we can maybe get a handle on our global warming in a way that we couldn't have in the status quo prior to the pandemic.
Do you think this may be the moment where the world begins to transition to do that low carbon thing? Is this the thing that we've been sort of waiting for?
One of the things that I often ask energy experts, especially those who specialize in technology adoption, is, do we have enough technology? Because Bill Gates always says we need an energy miracle. We don't have enough, and I disagree with Bill. I think we have plenty of technology. We just haven't I was going to use the word diffuse. It hasn't been diffused or adopted into the economy at the scale that it needs to. We have, and we tend to concentrate when we think of new energy technologies, we think of the usual suspects, right? Wind, solar, batteries, electric vehicles, charging infrastructure, that kind of stuff. But the beauty of this energy transition is that there are literally thousands and thousands of new technologies that have been under development and getting into the market over the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years that are now mature and ready to play their role in the switch to low carbon. And many of these they're not sexy. They're not, nobody's going to be writing stories about them in the Calgary Herald, but nevertheless, they're one little cog in the machine that needs to happen if we're going to make this transition in a, quick and efficient manner. And I'll give you one example, because this is a key point for anybody who's worried about Alberta employment. 3 years ago, I wrote my first deep dive on the effect of digital technology on employment in the oil and gas industry. And, artificial intelligence, automation, robotics, quantum computing, all that stuff. I got roasted on LinkedIn by CEOs and vice presidents of oil companies and service companies. I got called names like you wouldn't believe. Where are we now? Exactly. Everybody from the big companies to the small companies are adopting all of that digital technology. And it's destroying jobs just like I said it would.
Right.
But while that was going to have a negative effect on oil patch employment in Alberta, it's going to have a much more positive effect on the diffusion of new energy technologies around the world, because those are enabling technologies. You can take artificial intelligence and machine learning, and you can make it, and I'm no expert here, so I'm a little out of my depth, but what I understand is you can take it and you can make it more efficient. You can solve problems, you can lower costs, you can increase efficiencies in a way you couldn't do in the absence of those digital technologies. So I think we're seeing the convergence of all of these trends, and I buckle up, folks. The 2020s are going to be a decade of rapid technological change, and we're going to look back in 2030 on 2020, and we're going to say, wow, we have come so far in a short period of time. We're not going to recognize the world in 2030 when we get there.
So a phrase that I'm starting to hear come up more is like a just recovery for all, which is similar to a just transition. Although you could just as easily talk about a Green New Deal, a green stimulus. I use the phrase an Alberta New Deal when I'm talking to Albertans, because I feel like we can just get rid of that word green and just talk about what kind of changes we'd like to see here. Other than the pivot to materials and carbon fiber, are there some low-hanging fruit that you think, like if Alberta wants to do a low-carbon transition, these are the industries they should be looking at. This is the technology they should be looking at building, or et cetera?
A couple of responses to that question, Steve. One of them is methane emissions. Goodness gracious. The Canadian Energy Research Institute, which is one of my favorite think tanks, are very, very good, based out of Calgary. They did a study in late 2019 on methane emissions in the Western Canadian natural gas supply chain. And what they found should have made Jason Kenney blush, because Kenney and the Energy War Room, and they're banging on all the time about how Alberta natural gas can make green LNG, and then it can displace coal in China, which is a whole separate conversation and has all sorts of problems with it. But what CIRI found is that in BC, which makes 5 billion cubic feet of natural gas a day, their emissions are 2.2 megaton a year, which is about a 0.3% leak rate. And I think everybody knows that 3% is the threshold where if the leak rate is higher, then natural gas is worse than coal. In Alberta, that makes twice that amount, so it makes 10 billion cubic feet a day of natural gas, and the emissions are 24.5 megatons a year. And it's very likely that that's understated, that's underestimated, because we do a very, very bad job of measuring methane emissions in the oil patch. So the odds are that the leak rate is actually, the average leak rate is over 3%. And that needs to change. I mean, that is, if there is low hanging fruit for reducing emissions, there's 24.5 megatons a year right there that industry, if it methane is essentially what they sell. So put it back in the pipe, keep it in the pipe, keep it in the facility, fix the broken valves, don't vent and flare as, you know, at all would be ideal, but or as much. And let's get that down to like 2 and 3 and 4 megatons a year. And so there's some low hanging fruit. Now, there's another part of this. So we're going to, you know, we hear diversification, lots of talk about diversification. And in 2018, the Notley government brought out their Energy Diversification Advisory Committee, released its report, I think it was like February of 2018. And full disclosure, I was contracted to do the final copy edit for that report. So just put that out there. Mm-hmm. And the one thing that when I was discussing with the co-chairs, Gil McGowan and Jeanette Patel, I said, where is technology? The oil field, one of the things it does do is generate a tremendous amount of innovation and technology that could be applied to clean tech. It could be applied to other industries that have nothing to do with oil and gas. There's, you know, measurement and software and all kinds of things that you'd be shocked at what happens in Calgary and Edmonton and Lloydminster and Red Deer and places like that. We don't know about it. And there is an opportunity to diversify the economy by focusing on that technology and either A, scaling up so we can sell it into other energy producing countries, or B, pivot into other industries and in other countries. And we could be creating good paying jobs, technical jobs, trades jobs like that. And we sit on that technology and just use it within Canada. And I think that's a shame. So there, if we're talking about low hanging fruit, cut methane emissions a lot in a hurry, and put some effort into building out the technology sector in Alberta. I think that is low hanging fruit in my opinion.
Okay, great. I've got one more question for you before we turn things over to our panelists. What advice, what do you recommend for climate activists like myself and organizations like the Calgary Climate Hub so that we can influence our government to the low carbon transition that we know that we need?
That's another really good question. So here's, your viewers probably don't know this, but I've been blackballed by CAP. My name is used as a curse word in the Calgary Petroleum Club. So even though I sit here and I talk about how we should have the oil sands industry around and it should pivot into materials and we want to keep that there and the jobs and all of that, the oil patch is really, really tribal. It's partisan, hyper-partisan, it's hyper-conservative. And if you're not in the tribe, then what you say is, you know, remember Rachel Curran, Stephen Harper's strategy advisor? Well, on Twitter not that long ago, she called me a radical eco-terrorist who wanted to burn Alberta down to the ground. I mean, nothing could be more ridiculous, but this is how the industry is for much of it. Not all of it, but a lot of it is. Now, here's what happened. Anybody, are you familiar, Steve, with the Business Council of Alberta?
Yeah.
Right. So that got formed a couple of years ago. And if you look at the members in it, it's got, you know, Suncor and Cenovus and ATB and all the big players, WestJet, all the big players in the Alberta corporate community. Why would they go and form another business association outside of the Chamber of Commerce? Mm-hmm. Because this is where the progressive executives went. They didn't want to work through CAP. They didn't want to work through the Chambers of Commerce and the usual, so they formed their own group. And yeah, they've got some crazy right-wing maniacs like Michael Binion, you know, the architect of the CPC energy strategy. Yes, they have some of those that they're, you know, almost like fruits and nuts. Your crazy uncle that you have to Thanksgiving dinner, you can't do without him. But nevertheless, the Business Council of Alberta called for a sales tax. They want to reform the fiscal model for the government, and they advocate for a sales tax. They want to do they want to create a 20-year plan for economic and industrial development in Alberta that pivots to the low carbon economy.
Right.
And so what your Climate Hub folks could do is link up with organizations like that, because at the end of the day, where Alberta is going to go depends on those big players, because we're going to be stuck with the Kenney government for at least another 3 years. My guess would be another 7 or 8 years. And so working with the big players who cut the checks and have, who have that kind of clout, if they're headed in that direction, support that direction and support. They want stronger climate policy. I've interviewed Adam Legg, the executive director. I've interviewed their economist, and they are much more in line with the federal climate policy and with the Notley climate leadership plan. So there's something you can do. Send them an email, write them, pick up the phone and call them, encourage them that, let them know that they have that kind of support within Alberta for their agenda, which they don't do a very good job of promoting.
I'll tell you what, I'll go you one better. When so even the Calgary Chamber of Commerce, after the tech revelation, let's call it, they announced via Twitter that, okay, it's time for us to actually do a climate plan. And similarly, that same Alberta Council as well. And so we did reach out to them, because prior to me doing these interviews, I also do they're called the Calgary Community Climate Conversation, and we bring a host of experts into communities so people can talk to different experts in the climate realm. And so we would be very, very happy to take that event and go to the Chamber of Commerce and hold that event there with them. It's a place that's non-judgmental. It's all about just, getting information and bona fide conversation. So I would certainly take any recommendation that you have, or if you were to send us anybody that you think may be able to help us do that. We'd like to help do exactly what you're describing there. So I'm really glad you answered that question exactly the way you did. So, okay, before we get to the panelists, I better, number one, plug in my device before it powers out on me. But I also want to just talk about our sponsor. So Skyfire Energy has been designing and installing solar PV systems for homeowners, business owners, utilities, municipalities, and First Nations since 2001. They're an employee-owned, certified B Corporation with offices in Calgary, Edmonton, Penticton, and Regina. Their staff is one of the most experienced and qualified teams in the industry, having completed many of the largest and most complex solar projects in Western Canada. Their vision is to bring the magic of solar power to the world for a stronger, healthier, and more sustainable global community. I'd also like to just mention, if you'd like to broaden your knowledge of the ever-evolving Alberta energy scene beyond what you're hearing here today, you should consider purchasing Mr. Hislop's book, The New Alberta Advantage. It's available on his website at energi.media, and that's ENERGI.media, and we've attached links in the chat, so you can go right there and buy it right now if you like. And you can also follow Markham on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, where he hosts a number of interviews with experts from across the energy and climate sector in Western Canada. Who do you have coming up soon to interview there, Markham, quickly?
Well, we're going to have on next week, we're going to have Robert Hornung, who is the new executive director of the Canadian Renewable Energy Association. We've got a fellow named Richard Adamson from Calgary, who is involved in carbon capture and storage. That's a fascinating story. Carbon capture and storage has dropped to about $40 a ton and is becoming viable. And we've got some other new energy technology folks who will be interviewing as well.
Awesome. So that's where you want to go, folks, if you want to learn a little bit more. Markham does some great work. Okay, so our first panelist that we have lined up, I believe, is Amy Spark, who is a Climate Hub ally and also the Sustainability Coordinator for Bow Valley College. I think we've just got to unmute her mic. Yeah, well, it looks like she's coming up here.
All
There
right.
she is.
Thanks, Markham, so much for your presentation. It was really interesting. I just want to pick up on this thread of innovation and entrepreneurial spirit, because I think Alberta loves to talk about how innovative we are, but from what I see, I think we're innovative within a very narrow band of what we can change. And I think only in Alberta would it be seen as a radical act to change from one carbon economy to another carbon economy, right? When you're talking about carbon fiber. So if you wouldn't mind kind of explaining why carbon fiber is such a good climate decision, right? So kind of from a devil's advocate position, to me, that doesn't actually seem like a very radical position. So can you just explain a little bit more why it is?
Well, in terms of being radical, and thanks very much, Amy, for your kind words. In terms of being radical, the way it's viewed within the industry, they have produced for fuel for the last, I don't know, what, 120 years, 130, 40 years. I mean, this is a deeply conservative culture that's dominated by engineers, you know, and I say all the time, you know, if you ask engineers to innovate within the box, they're very innovative. You ask them to innovate outside the box, they get really uncomfortable. And if you ask them to change the box, their head explodes. And essentially the way they see it is that when you switch, if you switch from producing for the fuels market to the materials market, it's like changing the box, and they just discombobulate, because that's, you know, that's not what they're accustomed to. They're very, very hidebound. It's one of the problems, I complain about this all the time in my columns and on social media, is that the leadership within the industry is dominated by engineers or other scientists like geophysicists and geoscientists, lawyers and accountants. And I challenge you to find more conservative, hidebound professions than those ones, especially within the oil and gas industry. So asking, and then of course, you've got the big companies that have the clout. These are huge companies. They make $20 billion a year. They just don't move very quickly. And so the challenge is, while we're sitting on the outside looking in saying, well, you know, what's the problem here? Come on, this is, why wouldn't you want to make 4 times as much money with, you know, making carbon fiber as you do with sending dilbit off to Houston? And within their culture, it's very different. And I think one of the things we have to do that's really critical is we need to change the narrative in Canada around energy. Because part of the reason why they're changing now is because the culture around energy in Canada and even in Alberta is changing. And that changes their expectations. It's like, you know, you hear about the Overton window, you know, which is, if you think about the far left over here and the far right over here, and where is that window of acceptable discourse where we can, you know, talk about things? And the political parties are always fighting to get the window this way or get the window that way. Well, the Overton window on energy has been slowly shifting towards the energy transition and the climate change, and that has affected their thinking. So what we need them to do is to move quicker. And that's one of the reasons why I'm unpopular in the Petroleum Club, is because I say, well, you know, you have an aspiration to be net zero in 2050. Well, great, I have an aspiration to be a billionaire. That ain't going to happen. And, you know, you need a commitment. And why 2050? Why can't you do it in 2030 or 2040 at the latest? Why do we have to move at the speed of an engineer? I can't imagine anything that would be snails and engineers. That's about, you know, the pace we're talking about. That's unacceptable. And if we want them to change, partly we need to change the policy framework, and partly we need to change the culture around how the discourse, the narrative, how we talk and think. And when we change that, that puts pressure on them to change as well. So I hope I've answered your question.
Yeah, I will. And I appreciate that you brought up the Overton window, because I think that's certainly a very helpful policy tool that we can use, or at least a kind of a cognitive tool. I guess my follow-up question would be, but why is carbon fiber, or is carbon fiber actually a climate smart solution? Or is it just less bad than a fuel production economy? Do you see what I'm saying?
Gotcha, understood. So carbon fiber, turning bitumen into carbon fiber is climate friendly, because first of all, now you're not burning it, where 80% of the emissions take place. And if the oil sands companies can get to net zero emissions, then you've done something good for the climate, for the GHG emissions. But there's another side of this. If making carbon fiber more or less expensive, if they cut the costs in half, and then the automotive industry can use it, and then they can electrify quicker, they can bring down costs and make vehicles lighter and have longer range and blah blah blah. You have a knock-on effect. You have a secondary effect that's kind of positive, but you had planned on that. So if you can reduce emissions in the production side and then produce a product that speeds up the adoption of electric vehicles, electrification of transportation, I think that's a big thing. It's a significant contribution to us lowering emissions.
Thanks for explaining that a little bit more. So I'll pass it over to Joe. I think he's next.
That's right, Amy. See, you might even get a co-host spot here, Amy. That's wonderful. Joe, you're next up.
Hello, Markham. I was wondering, we talk a lot about a lot of things. One thing we've never really talked about is the media landscape in this province. I think it's universally accepted that post media sucks and is not reliable source, especially on terms of climate. They occasionally have some vaguely interesting article, but generally do not. So aside from Energi Media, which I know is a reliable source of information, where would you turn to for information on the energy landscape in Alberta? And then maybe a follow-up question to that is what can we do to make things better?
Boy, that's a question that's near and dear to my heart, Joe, and I'm glad you asked it, but it doesn't come with an easy answer. So if we'd been having this conversation 4 or 5 years ago, the easy answer would have been, well, the Tyee and the National Observer on the West Coast, because, they, for instance, Linda Solomon Wood, the publisher of the National Observer, says right in her mission statement, that they're there to be critics of the energy industry. The problem is that they have not, both the Tyee and the National Observer have not been good journalists. They have not been good energy journalists. And I have this, Linda and I like each other, but we really disagree on this topic. And she doesn't like the fact that I criticize the Observer, because what they do is they invite opinion writers who are fabulous. And by that, I mean, they just invent stuff. There is no, if you want to know if somebody's writing or reporting good energy journalism, look at their sources. Sources are, in our business, are everything. If I can get a Dr. Sarah Hastings-Simons from the University of Calgary, or I can get an economist from UBC, or if I can get, Dr. Monica Gattinger from the University of Ottawa, those are gold-plated sources. When they do an on-the-record interview, they put their name behind what they say, and that means something. So if you read a piece and there are no sources, it's Joe Blow who, read a study or two and, has a subscription to Mother Jones and that sort of thing, that's not good journalism. And too much of what the Observer and the Tyee have done in the past looks like that. And the other thing is, another source of misinformation, it comes out of the West Coast and so-called experts like David Hughes and Robin Allen. And I know they're darlings of the climate movement and the environmental movement, but the fact is that they're not trained energy economists. They're not experts in the energy industry. They're sort of recycled professionals who at the end of their career have gone on and done some research. But when you read their work, it's full of errors. I mean, it's full of errors that I can take it apart. Never mind send it off to economists who actually know the energy sector. So misinformation is a real problem in energy journalism. And there are a few. Max Fawcett, Max is a buddy of mine, and some of his stuff we agree on the climate change and the energy transition. He takes a much more analytical and objective view of things. I've chosen to take more of a confrontational and a street brawling approach on social media and in my columns, though on other parts of it I'm much more technical and objective, like in the deep dives. But nevertheless, Chris Turner is really good. There are a few. I used to think Chris Varco at the Herald was okay, but you know, late he's drunk the Kool-Aid from the oil patch. There are a few others, but there are maybe between. There's only a handful of good energy journalists left in this country, and the ones that are left, for the most part, like Max and Chris and I, you know, we run like hamsters on a wheel trying to both do our work and make a living, and it's really tough. It's really tough. So I don't have a good answer for you, Joe. One thing I can tell you is that the journalism that gets done in Alberta by the mainstream players, like, you know, the TV stations and even CBC and so on, it ain't great. It really, it should be much better. And the fact that it isn't better makes it difficult to hold the government to account and to, you know, for poor policy and poor decisions. So I'm sorry I can't be more optimistic, but that's a tough space.
Okay, thank you there. Thanks for the question, Joe. Next up, we have Joy Shokir is her name, and she does some work with a great group that I'm really impressed with called Permeate Calgary. So they're pulling together a Green New Deal for Calgary is one of the things that they're doing. And she's also involved with a group called Hands on Growing, which is in the urban permaculture space, and I think is also doing impressive things. So I've put connections to their Facebook and their website and their Twitter. It'll show up in the chat here. But for now, take it away, Joy.
Hi, Joy.
Thank you. So I was really excited to actually look at some of the stuff that you were presenting here, especially with the energy declaration. There was something you didn't really touch upon in this talk so far, but that was on your website that I thought was really interesting. So the question I want to ask is, considering the colonial legacy of resource extraction in Canada, how do you envision the role of Indigenous peoples as Alberta eventually transitions from fossil fuels?
This is a really complex issue, and one that I am not really well qualified to talk about it. I've done some work and I have some general approaches to it. In the Energy Declaration, I call for, and I echo Robert Janes, who's a lawyer out of Vancouver, and who I interviewed about the Wet'suwet'en blockade of coastal GasLink pipeline construction. And what he said was that under Section 35 of the Constitution, under Aboriginal consultation, there are calls for constitutional conferences to resolve some of these outstanding issues. And I supported that. I thought that was a good idea. And he's a veteran, Indigenous law expert. And what I would like to see is somehow we have to square this circle where Canada has a natural resource extraction industry. So we want to create jobs, and we want to create jobs for First Nation and Métis people, Indigenous communities. And at the same time, we have to respect their land, Aboriginal title, and we have to respect their traditional territories. And especially in BC, where almost all of the territory is unceded, and it's a wicked problem, is what it is. The approach I took in the Energy Declaration is that we must somehow find that Canadian compromise where we can reconcile. And by the way, J.P. Gladue, who used to head up the Canadian Aboriginal Business Council, talks about economic reconciliation. And that made a lot of sense to me. And so if we can help Indigenous communities to own the means of production, to own whether it's businesses or utilities or whatever it is, then I think that's an important part of this equation. and is in addition to recognizing Aboriginal title and other legal requirements. But boy, this is a tough one. So I know that's not a really satisfactory answer, and I wish I could give you an easy, a clearer answer. But I can't. I wrestle with this all the time, the complexities of it. Sorry, I hope that helped.
It does, yes. Thank you for addressing that.
Okay, is there? Do you have a follow-up question, Joy, or did that pretty much take it?
That pretty much, yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Can
Well,
I
thank you
make
so
a
much.
point?
Yes, go ahead, Markham.
Steve, I want to make a point that it's in the Energy Declaration, but I haven't made it here. But it's germane to most of the questions that have been asked so far and your comments. And that is how we perceive of climate change and the energy transition. So I think the dominant view is that, oh my God, the temperature is rising and we're in big trouble. We're in a climate crisis and we have to switch off fossil fuels. And that's why we have to transition away from oil and gas and coal and into basically electrify the global economy. I don't look at it that way. I see, okay, I agree with all of that about the climate crisis, but the solution but that's the problem. We know the problem really well. I've interviewed lots of climate scientists. I accept the science. We know we have to get going on this. The solution is the energy transition. And the energy transition, we're into it 20 years from now, we're into it 20 years already. So the way I see it is we need to start concentrating more on the solution. And I describe, the metaphor I use is, think of the energy transition as the bus and the climate policy is the pedal, the accelerator pedal. So how fast do you want the energy transition to go? Well, if you want it faster, press harder on the policy pedal. And knowing that as you do that you're going to incur more risk, that you break things or get it wrong, and that it's going to cost you more money. But when you think of it in those terms, within that framework, then it becomes a risk management issue. On the one hand, we have the climate crisis, which is clearly an existential threat, and that is tremendous risk. And then you can, on the other, you balance that equation with how much risk of breaking stuff and how much financial risk are Canadians willing to accept. And then you can have that conversation. Well, what if you just, a little more risk here so that we could, press that pedal harder so that the bus can go faster, and then we can get to meet our climate targets. And I think that what that does is it simplifies a really, really complex issue so that we can have a constructive conversation rather than just be throwing buns at each other all the time.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a point to be made there. I want to take one quick question from the Zoom feed, and then one from the Facebook Live, and then we'll close things off here. We have Precious DL is the name of the person that's on the Zoom cast, and they're asking that how can the Alberta's education sector support the low carbon transition?
Boy, that's a really good question. And to be honest with you, I haven't put a lot of thought into it. But one of the things that did occur to me, we're working on a project. We keep getting dragged into these, breaking news stories and big debates, and I don't put as much time into it. But we call it the Climate Science and Energy Transition Series, where we interview, say, climate scientists. And the idea is that I want to talk to Denis Gilbert, who's an oceanographer for Environment and Climate Canada, and his thing is climate change and oceans. So I interview him for 4 minutes. Please explain this concept to me, Dr. Gilbert. Then we spend the next 4 minutes talking about, Dr. Gilbert, explain to me and our viewers why we should trust your science. Explain to me, why you say you have high confidence in this. Why do you have high confidence in it? And then he goes on, and they're always happy. Trust me, the scientists love that question, because then they get to explain why they're right? But they're also very cautious, because they'll say, no, on this issue we have low confidence, or this issue we have medium confidence. We need more work so that we can raise our confidence. Anyway, it's a great idea for a series, and we just need some sponsors and and to get to work on this thing. But there's a library of educational resources, and I've forgotten the name of it, but they've agreed to host all of the links to our climate science series that we want to make available to the K-12 system in Alberta, as well as university and college students who are interested in climate science. And we'll do a bunch of them, with respect to, on Alberta climate issues. And then there's a library of expert interviews with scientists that I think, the science is irrefutable. So if you hear it, right, 8 minutes of talking, listening to a scientist explain that particular issue. So that's our contribution, Steve, to trying to work with and have some influence, a little, not much yet, but hopefully going forward, we can do that so that library of expert interviews is available across Canada. I mean, anybody could access it.
Okay, excellent. That's almost it for this week's Climate of Change. Markham, once again, I want to thank you so much for coming on tonight. I'll remind our viewers once again to follow Markham on Facebook and Twitter. You can find him on YouTube as well. And you should get his book, The New Alberta Advantage, on his website at energi.media. That's ENERGI. And again, all the links are in the chat. We've got a full range of links there. We do have a few other questions that are posted here. I'm hoping that we can reach out to you via social networks to get some answers on that front. Markham, you're pretty accessible on Twitter, I find.
Happy to answer any questions if I can.
Excellent. So on next week's show, we will have Celia Lee and Noel Keogh from Sustainable Calgary, who just launched their 2020 State of Our City report, which you can currently download from their website, sustainablecalgary.org. Again, that's in our chat. Or you can actually pick up a hard copy at Page's Books on Kensington. That'll be a good one next week, so you don't want to miss that. And we'll include the RSVP link. Actually, I don't know if we have that one yet, so you'll have to hang tight on that. If you like this Thursday night broadcast, we want you to know, once again, it wouldn't be possible without our excellent sponsor, Skyfire Energy. They've paved the way for solar in Western Canada and will certainly be a big part of our future. I once again should also mention the Calgary Climate Hub, the organization very near and dear to my heart. If it's important to you to be a part of an organization that's moving the ball, I would advise you to look into the Calgary Climate Hub and go to calgaryclimatehub.ca. That's also in the links. I can only tell you that if you do experience anxiety on the part of climate, you're not alone. I do. And one of the things that alleviates that anxiety is to work with a bunch of smart people on legitimately influencing municipal politics and policy. And so I recommend as strongly as I can, especially if you do feel that anxiety, join a group, a climate group, and Permeate Calgary is another good group, and there's other good groups, but Calgary Climate Hub is my favorite, and that's who you should join. I want to thank our volunteers, Shay, Joan, and Paul, for helping me put this thing out here today. And finally, I'd like to thank you, the viewer, for tuning in and caring about the right things. Good night for now, and let's get to work.